Tensions escalate over the South China Sea as Australia appears to back the United States in declaring China's maritime claims unlawful. Is Canberra changing course, or in a recent speech, President Rodrigo Duterte advocates diplomacy, not war, to solve his country's South China Sea dispute with China? What does that mean in concrete terms? To talk about these issues, I'm joined by Dr. Xue Chen, Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, Richard Javad Hedarian, Security Analyst and Professor of Political Science from Manila, Rod Campbell, Research Director at the Australia Institute, and Michael Johns, former White House speechwriter to President Bush. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me start with you, Richard. During a State of the Nation address, President Rodrigo Duterte said, well, the country cannot afford to go to war with China over disputes in the South China Sea. It seems that he is suggesting the issues were better treated as diplomatic endeavors. Was that President Duterte's putting on the table a peace offer?
Yeah, it's not very clear what's the basis for President Duterte to say that there's going to be war. I mean, the last time we had any skirmishes in the South China Sea was back in 1988. And as far as Philippines and China are concerned, we have not had any kind of military skirmishes or conflict as far as modern history is concerned. So it's more likely that this is a rhetorical device by President Duterte to push back against some of his critics, some in the opposition, who are suggesting that the Philippines has to develop a stronger security cooperation with the United States, including allowing Americans to have more ability to put preposition weaponries in key bases in the Philippines. In fact, the President mentioned during the State of the Nation address that there are plans by the United States to return to the Subic Bay. I suppose he's suggesting Americans putting weaponries there, and also Americans putting more and more weaponries and other kind of military hardware in other bases close to the South China Sea, whether the Bautista Air Base in Palawan or in the Basa Air Base near the Scarborough. So I think this is more a rhetorical device by President Duterte to suggest that let's not rock the boat. The situation is already a little bit on the edge. The best way to move forward is dialogue, and that's what exactly I've been trying to do for the past 4 years of my administration.
But his address comes after your foreign minister, foreign secretary actually, called on China to adhere to the ruling of the South China Sea arbitration case. Of course, that arbitration China has been rejecting from the very beginning. Is this mixed messages?
I mean, let's keep in mind this is the third foreign secretary of President Duterte, and Secretary Locsin has sounded quite different on the South China Sea issue in comparison to his predecessors, especially former Secretary of Foreign Affairs and current Congress, Alan Peter Cayetano. So I think what we have seen over the past year and so is that with the arrival of a new foreign secretary, we see a more strident language coming out of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And let's not forget also the Department of National Defense. In fact, one of the first top officials in Southeast Asia, if not Asia, to somehow welcome Secretary Pompeo's latest statement in the South China Sea was the Philippine National Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana, who said that we also have to make sure that everyone follows international law. So you have both the Foreign Secretary of the Philippines and the Defense Secretary of the Philippines, in one way or another, speaking in a much more strident language vis-a-vis China than President Duterte. So President Duterte perhaps wants to have an independent foreign policy from U.S., but some of his top officials seem to at least sound like independent foreign policy from President Duterte and sounding more different. So it actually also reflects some internal debates that are going on in the Philippines on how to deal with the challenges in the South China Sea. But I think President Duterte made it clear in the State of the Nation address that there's not going to be a radical shift in Philippine policy on the South China Sea as he enters his twilight years in office.
So are you saying that the Philippine government has not agreed on how to go forward with the arbitration decision years ago?
The thing is this, I mean, even if you look at the recent decision by the Philippines to suspend its abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States, that would have been quite a big deal, undermining the alliance between the two countries for the past century. The Foreign Secretary announced that. He said it's upon the President's instruction, and yet up until today, I have not heard any speech by President Duterte explaining why he made that decision. So my hunch, and I've been writing on this extensively, is that it seems there's some very vociferous internal debates in the administration, and that the president himself has back and forth with a lot of top officials, a lot of people inside the government who are saying that we have to have a strong alliance with the United States, that we cannot trust China, we have to take a tougher stance. The reality is this: the Philippines, the only way that it could put significant pressure on China is that if there is unison within the government, and also there's a significant ramp up in defense and security cooperation with the United States. And so far, we do not see that unison. And by the way, the Philippines is still the country coordinator for ASEAN and China, and it's overseeing the Code of Conduct negotiation. So I think President Duterte and even top officials like Secretary Locsin want to make sure that they don't also sound too anti-China or too critical of China, because they want to be also honest brokers of a code of conduct to oversee the rules of the road for a peaceful management, if not resolution, of the South China Sea disputes between ASEAN and China. So there are multiple interests, multiple voices, and it seems President Duterte himself is constantly recalibrating and rebalancing there. But so far, we don't see a significant change in President Duterte's rhetoric towards China, although some of his top officials are taking a different line. And that's how the Philippines is. It has a bifurcated and sometimes messy kind of foreign policy.
You mentioned the Code of Conduct, and how is Philippines arbitration work going on, and what are the contents that are going to be included in the Code of Conduct, obviously under discussion?
Yeah, I think the most important development on that was the recent statement by ASEAN in late June, whereby it clarified, I think for the first time, I've been looking at the statements of ASEAN for quite some time, that only the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea should be as a basis, legal reference point for management and resolution of maritime and territorial disputes in the area. I mean, along those lines, that was a statement that came from ASEAN. Now, it is one thing for the ASEAN to say UNCLOS per se, meaning no other alternative principles, including China's historic rights claims or 9-line claim, but it's another thing for the ASEAN to openly say that it should be based on the UNCLOS arbitration award initiated by the Philippines. It has not gone that far, but certain countries within the ASEAN, particularly Indonesia, are more moving in that direction, invoking the Philippine arbitration award to question China's historic rights and 9-line claim. And Vietnam is also threatening to move forward finally with a kind of arbitration against China. From my understanding, it's still a political question that they're discussing in Hanoi. So I think this is where it's interesting. On the level of ASEAN, there's a little bit of a pushback. There's more clarity on what's going to be the legal reference point. No optimism that the Code of Conduct will be finalized anytime soon, but key countries within ASEAN are more moving towards the Philippines on the question of arbitration award and UNCLOS as the sole basis for dealing with the South China Sea disputes. And I think that's where we see China trying to make efforts to mend relations with some of the Southeast Asian key countries here.
And we have Mr. Xue on the line. So, Dr. Xue, if those ASEAN countries will base the dispute resolution on the UNCLOS principles, did China have different claims with the Philippines, Vietnam, and probably Malaysia? How will the disputes on those islands be solved diplomatically if there are different understandings of principles?
Actually, yes. Actually, we already had a very good kind of document, which is called a Declaration on the Conduct of the parties in the South China Sea, which is signed between the claimant states, including China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and endorsed by the ASEAN in 2002. The Article 4, which claims that all the parties shall solve those disputes through the peaceful means, and also non-use and threat to use of force. But Article 5, listed several issues that before the pending the resolution of the disputes, we have several other things that we can do first. So with this declaration, which we call this DOC, in enforcement and fully empowered, then we believe that this lay the political basis for the resolution to solve those territorial disputes and also the maritime disputes.
And is this still the case that China seek to solve those disputes bilaterally rather than multilaterally?
Either way, I should say that China, on one hand, would not reject any kind of a peaceful means and then the peaceful resolutions with the claimant state bilaterally. But on the other hand, the China has been called on for the kind of reaching the conclusion of the COC negotiations, which is a code of conduct of the parties in the South China Sea. So it's kind of a two ways. Bilaterally, we will not reject a kind of a bilateral resolutions on those issues, like the China-Filipino joint development framework agreement in the South China Sea. But also we are engaging in those multilateral, consultations, talks, and also negotiations. For example, like COC.
And earlier I asked Richard about the President Duterte's recent message. He's basically saying that the Philippines will not go to war with China over some disputed islands. What is your reading of President Duterte's message?
Actually, it's on one hand, it's kind of, I believe, a realist analysis on the so-called military mismatch between China and the Philippines. President Duterte openly gave this remark that we cannot fight a war with China. But on the other hand, the two sides, the two governments have already reached a consensus that the two states should solve or put aside the sovereignty disputes and then to find a way toward a joint development between the two states. And then also we will not lay the basis of the so-called the Filipino arbitration as a basis, political basis for solve this issue. So we have a kind of a consensus between the two states for a kind of a bilateral relationship in a broad way rather than the South China Sea disputes itself.
And Australia has also joined the fray, and now we have Rod Campbell on the line. Rod, in a declaration filed at the UN, Australia said it rejected China's maritime claims in the South China Sea as inconsistent with the UNCLOS. Why Australia making such a declaration, and why now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's two parts to this story. The first part is what is actually in the letter that the Australian government sent to the United Nations, and the other part is the politics around the letter. If you actually go and read the text of the letter itself, it's really not very controversial. It simply states Australia's position as being in line with the United Nations law of the sea around maritime boundaries. It expresses support for international court decisions. The content of the letter is not controversial. I don't think anyone in the Chinese government could possibly have been surprised by the actual content of the letter. What is surprising and controversial is the timing of the letter. The timing comes as the Trump administration seems to be doing everything it possibly can to antagonize China. They're getting ready for an election in which their main election strategy seems to blame China for every possible problem that the country has. And the Australian government, in writing this letter now, has basically tied itself to the domestic political agenda of the Trump administration. I don't think that serves Australia's national interests. I think it's quite a stupid thing to do.
All right. We've also collected some opinions on the internet on why Australia is involved in this in the first place. Let's take a look. There are different opinions, obviously, on social media. platforms. Paul Barrett said, can anyone explain to me why it is a good idea for 5 Australian naval vessels to be exercising in the South China Sea with US, Japan, and India at this particular time? Escalating tension with China might be good for Trump's election campaign, but can't see what it does for us. So this question is basically what you asked, Rod. Why now? And what does it do to Australians in terms of national security or economic interests?
Well, it does absolutely nothing for Australia's national security. I think recent history has shown that the security of Australians is far more closely related to health around the pandemic and climate change issues around our bushfires that we experienced at the start of the year. This is certainly not helping Australian security. And it's not really helping Australia's international relations more broadly. This isn't a deep diplomacy tied in with partners in Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. It's not really attempting to mend relations with China. It's not emphasising the many, many things that Australia has in common with China. As Paul Barrett says, as I've said, this is about support for the Trump government, and it baffles me as to how this is in Australia's national interests to be sending this now. The content of the letter is good. Australia should be expressing support for international law and international court cases. I think the Australian public expects that, but the timing of it is very curious and very problematic.
And also, as you said, this probably make more political sense for Morrison's government because the annual U.S.-Australia bilateral forum, ASEAN, is about to take place this week. This is a very strong message that Canberra is in line with Washington in concerning China.
Yeah, that's right. Our foreign minister and defence minister have somewhat controversially flown to the United States. Given the pandemic issues, a lot of people wondered why this couldn't have been done over phone or internet. It will mean that the ministers have to go into isolation on their return. So it's been a controversial thing to go to this meeting in person, and it appears that the timing of this letter, has everything to do with that meeting and showing support for Washington, support that, from a strategic sense, if push came to shove, Australia has very little to back up with.
And Dr. Xue, if this is the message from Australia, what can China do? We understand China is still Australia's largest trade partner. Will China punish Australia economically because of the strategic choice of banding with America?
Personally speaking, I don't think that China would link the trade relationship between China and Australia with this Australian government position on the South China Sea. Though China will take a very strong objection to the Australian government position, as Australian government has been calling for the so-called independent inquiry of the source of the pandemic, the COVID-19. But from the Chinese perspective, it's not only a kind of honest, lawful actions. It's a kind of show the loyalty as the deputy sheriff to the Asia Pacific, to the United States. So largely, China would believe it's a kind of a politically motivated kind of a statement, because as previously mentioned, it's a kind of timing right after the Mike Pompeo's statement, the calling China, labeling China as a maritime empire.
But still, so, Australia is going forward.
That's the different
question
interpretation.
Is, what can China do to change the direction of policies in Canberra? If you don't punish Australia economically, they will still go ahead.
I believe that China already raised the flag as a kind of free trade, international free trade. And also, we didn't see yet the Chinese government decision to kind of have a kind of economic sanctions to link the South China Sea issue to this the trade issue. To change the Australians' course, I personally would propose a kind of a bilateral dialogue between Australia and China to clarify what the Australian position on the South China Sea, because Australia together with the United States are the two non-claimant states to the South China Sea. And also the United States is not a ratifying party to the UNCLOS. I don't know if those two countries have enough legitimacy, especially using the military means to justify its maritime claim under the title of enforcing the international law of the sea. That's a question mark. So I believe the dialogue, not like today's United States and China, there's totally shut off the dialogue channels between the two states. I'm not sure if it's the good timing for the Australian-Chinese dialogues, but I do believe it's an appropriate approach.
Yeah, just as you said, probably both the United States and Australia are shutting down the channels of dialogue on the South China Sea, and they are not claimants of UNCLOS, but they supported the claimants, the other claimants in ASEAN countries, to support the UNCLOS approach to solve this problem. China doesn't agree. Where does this go? Where does this go if there are so huge differences of how to solve this?
I do believe that there's a huge misunderstanding on the so-called the 2016 Filipino arbitration case, which is Mike Pompeo's and the Department of State statement on the South China Sea basically standing upon. Actually, it has nothing to do, even with the ruling of the arbitration case, there's nothing to do with the sovereignty disputes. It only has something to do with the interpretation and application, how you understand and apply the UNCLOS, the so-called UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So, but on the Article 281, if there is a kind of other peaceful means for the settlement, actually we do have between the Philippines and China, which is the DOC, as I mentioned. Then it should not be submitted to the so-called compulsory procedures entailing the decisions. So I should say, and also 283, which Article 283 argues that these disputed parties should have a kind of a prior consultations and also exchange of views. But this kind of a unilateral arbitration, but also has nothing to do with the sovereignties. But there is a huge misunderstanding in the major Western media that China's sovereignty has been denied by the arbitration. This is totally not the case.
All right, and
so
we have
I should say we needed time.
We have Michael Jones join us to talk about the U.S. perspective on this. He is former White House speechwriter. So, Michael, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated that the U.S. Maintained that South China Sea is not China's maritime empire and disputes must be resolved via international law. But ironically, the United States itself is not, has not ratified UNCLOS and is not a claimant country in this dispute. So China is probably very pissed off that the U.S. is pointing fingers at this issue.
Well, the 2016 arbitration that you mentioned, or that was just mentioned, was actually very clear, and that was that this so-called 9-dash line that China and China alone has claimed is a violation of that agreement that China is a signatory toward. That was not even a very contentious ruling in The Hague. It was a unanimous decision. And this essentially gets to the issue of free navigation for countries of that region. You know, Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan, others have just as much right to go through those waters as Beijing does.
But it seems no country has problems navigating and traveling in the sea.
Untrue. They're untrue. In fact, you know, from Australia to Vietnam to Philippines, you've seen repeated complaints and positions that have been raised about fishing rights and other commercial undertakings, and the military expansion of Beijing in that region is wholly illegal. Now, just to put some clarity on the U.S. position, our position has really been one that is consistent with international law, and that is that China cannot make these illegal territorial claims in the region. They have to go through this recourse, whether it's going back to The Hague or other means, and no neighbor of China, and no one in Washington of any significance.
But you didn't answer my question that the U.S. didn't sign that treaty in the first place, the UNCLOS treaty. Why has the U.S. the mandate to judge whether China is obeying the rule?
I don't know if I may jump in.
China signed this agreement. China agreed to abide by this agreement.
But the U.S.
China has not sought to remove itself from the Law of the Sea agreement, and the arbitrating body in 2016 ruled unanimously that China is acting illegally in the South China Sea with this 9-dash line approach that no single country that I'm aware of puts any credibility in, nor has the arbitrating body.
My question, the U.S. did not sign the treaty. Why should it judge China on this?
Because
I don't know if I may answer this question.
Yeah, Dr. Xue, you want to chime in?
Because China is a signatory to the agreement. China is a signatory to the agreement. They were a champion of the agreement. They thought it was a constructive initiative. Now, if they're rethinking that position, I suppose, you know, maybe they're not as supportive of it as they initially were. But the reality is, until they're out of the agreement or have otherwise litigated this in The Hague, the position of international law is absolutely clear on this. And the additional point is the military presence in the region is provocative. It's viewed provocative by all of the countries that have been involved in that area.
To what Michael just said. First of all, militarization, and second, the international law applicability.
Yes, I have something to say about the 9-dash line. First one, it's not invented by the People's Republic of China. It was actually proclaimed in 1947. Then the Chinese national government, then this 9-dash line. But neither then Chinese government and also the PRC government has clarified what the quality and the feature of the 9-dash line is. We never say it's the kind of a national, sovereignty boundary to claim that these are the inner waters. The whole South China Sea is inner waters.
What about the militarization? We have 30 seconds left, Dr. Xue.
The militarization, I should say, this.
I'm sorry, we are totally running out of time.
And President Xi Jinping.
I wish we had more time to talk about this, but we have to leave it here. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dr. Xue.
Thank you.
You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhu in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.